The camera on Dellwood Lane. I had never been one to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories and urban legends were just that, stories, meant to entertain or spook, but not to be taken seriously. That perspective held firm until the summer I decided to move into the old Dellwood house on the outskirts of town, a decision driven more by financial desperation than any desire to live alone in a house that had been unoccupied for years. The Dellwood house was nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by a wild and untended garden that gave it a forgotten, eerie appearance. The previous owners had left in a hurry for reasons unbeknownst to me at the time, leaving behind furniture and even personal belongings. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air, leaving the dust to settle undisturbed. On my second night, as I explored the contents of the house, I found an old camera in the attic. It was an antique, a bulky, heavy thing that looked like it had been quite expensive in its time. Curious, I dusted it off and peered through the viewfinder. To my surprise, it seemed to function perfectly, showing a clear view of the attic. That night, I placed the camera on my bedside table, planning to see if I could get it working with some new film the next day. The strangeness began that very night. I woke abruptly, a sense of unease crawling up my spine. The room was cold, far colder than it had been when I'd gone to sleep, and the camera was no longer on the bedside table where I'd left it. Instead, it was perched on the windowsill, pointed towards my bed. I froze, a chill running down my back not solely from the cold. I was sure I hadn't moved it, and I lived alone. Shaking off the unease, I returned the camera to the table and tried to go back to sleep, attributing the movement to my own forgetfulness. But in the morning, the camera was again on the windowsill. This time, however, there was a photo beside it, a photo of me sleeping. Disturbed but rationalizing it as a prank, albeit a sick one, I decided to set up a test. I locked all the doors and windows, checked the house thoroughly, and placed the camera back on the bedside. That night, I barely slept, my eyes flicking open at the slightest sound. Yet nothing happened. No cold, no moving cameras. I almost believed I had imagined it all. Almost. On the third night, the cycle repeated. I woke to the camera on the sill, another photo beside it. This photo was different. It showed me in bed, but there was a shadowy figure standing over me, its features blurred and indistinct. Panic gripped me as I realized this was no prank. Something unnatural was at play. I packed a small bag and fled the house, driving until I reached the safety of a motel in town. There, surrounded by the mundane buzz of life, I tried to piece together what had happened. I returned the next day, accompanied by a friend, daylight bolstering my courage. The house was exactly as I'd left it, no signs of forced entry, nothing amiss, except the camera and the photos. My friend suggested we develop the remaining film in the camera, a suggestion I hesitantly agreed to. The photos we developed from that film told a story I still struggle to accept. They depicted scenes from around the house, the attic, the hallways, the living room, but each contained that same, shadowy figure, always in the background, always watching. The final photo, however, was the most chilling. It showed the front door of the house from the outside, as if the entity had been waiting there, inviting me back. I never returned to Dellwood Lane. The house was put back on the market, and I moved far away from that town. Sometimes I catch myself wondering about the camera and the entity. Did it attach itself to the camera, or was it always part of the house? And more hauntingly, was it still waiting for someone to return and pick up the camera again? The answers, I hope, remain lost, buried within the walls of the Dellwood house.